So more people might join us. I'll just let them in as they do, but let's just make a start because we're here. So my name is Klaus, and Sarah is here with me, and we are very happy to start this webinar series. We've done these webinars before. It's always very interesting, and well, it is about dialogue. So if you have any input during the webinar, feel free to jump in. Let's make it dialogical, and we're happy. And we also always leave some time in the end so that we can have a chat about how this relate to your organizations and so on. So for this webinar, well, Sarah and I, we are out in organizations teaching how to optimize dialogue in organizations, and the sort of what we usually say is that the dialogue is the tool that you use for everything, whether it's conflict resolution, innovation, decision making. You use it for everything. So if you can optimize dialogue, you kind of optimize processes across the board. And this is why we find it so fascinating. And but rather than talking about it in the abstract, it can be quite nice to illustrate the power of dialogue by looking at how it relates to specific of these processes. And this is why we set up this um, these five webinars, so that we can look at how it applies to specific processes in the organization. And this time it is conflict resolution. So yes, and I think just to also have Sarah come in and say something here at the beginning, I'll hand over to you, and we're gonna look a little bit about your personal experiences of uh, viewpoint differences and versus conflict and those kind of things.
Great. Thank you, Klaus. Welcome, everybody, from whichever corner of the world you're joining from, whether you've got a heat wave going on like we have in the UK at the moment or not. So, and in a way, this session, you could describe it as being how do we turn down the heat in a meeting room when there is conflict? How do we create good dialogue out of viewpoint diversity, if I describe it in that way? If we just take a quick look at definitions of conflict, I'll just share a couple with you. So, Cambridge English Dictionary is defining conflict as an active disagreement between people with opposing opinions or principles. The Business Dictionary says conflict at work is about when you've got friction or opposition resulting from actual or perceived differences or incompatibilities. And so the word I really want to underline in those definitions of conflict is kind of friction or tension. And so conflict really arises not only when we have difference of opinion, but when there's tension in the atmosphere around that difference of opinion, because it's very natural, normal, understandable that people see things differently. It's only really becomes problematic or impacts the effectiveness of a board or a team when we've got that tension in the room. So in a way, what we're exploring here is how do we handle both difference and tensions productively? And so let me ask you then, there's a version of conflict that is unhealthy when that tension is getting in the way. And then there's and we'll come on to this in a moment, a more healthy version of conflict. But just using the chat, if you're willing, love to hear your wisdom on this, your language on this. What do you associate with negative or unhealthy conflict? How would you describe that? What do you notice in the meetings that you're in, whether that's as a participant, as a leader, as a facilitator, as a coach. Let's just put some language around this unhealthy version of conflict. I've been talking about tension and friction. Um, I remember somebody recently said, well, it's like, she said, my version of unhealthy conflict is that the room gets smaller. So, Noreen, thank you. Breakdown in communication where people are talking over each other, there's withdrawal, there's undermining each other. So, yeah, instead of the whole being greater than the sum of parts, it's less than the sum of parts. Unhandled. I'm curious about that. If you want to say more, there's people stop listening, there's snarky jokes that feel really pointed. And of course, that then adds to the difficult atmosphere. There's simmering below the surface that's felt in the body rather than it being over. Very well said, Shelley. I'm not catching everything here, but Steve, ugly stories, narratives, attribution narratives. Yeah, very interesting what attributions we make under conflict. So if I've skipped over your comment, forgive me, I might well catch up with the chat a little bit later as well. But Jill, they're getting entrenched in our own position. Yeah, in conflict, there's that real sense of people digging in. Position taking often becomes more rigid. And that, of course, is going to make productive dialogue much more of a challenge. So thank you. We've got a good sense, an excellent sense of conflict in the room that could really undermine a meeting, and both what's overt and tangible, but also what's beneath the surface. And one of the things that's beneath the surface is often difficult emotions. There's often frustration, agitation, disappointment. Difficult conversations are often about difficult emotions. Tomoka, good to see you here, having a possibility of causing lingering negative impact on later relationships. Absolutely. There can be a real residue left behind from unhealthy conflict. I'm going to ask you the opposite question then around healthy conflict, constructive conflict. You don't want everybody in the room agreeing with each other. What you want is that viewpoint diversity. So again, what do you notice in the meeting room, in a board session, in a team offsite when you're navigating this well? Listening before responding. Thank you, Noreen. Creative solutions, new insights. Yeah, energy gets released. Thank you, Shelley, in that sense of actually moving forward, making progress. There's psychological safety. Thank you, Andrew. So there's a sense that people could say things like, I don't know, ask for help, admit mistakes. A gossip blessing in disguise. There might be a sense of flow and openness, give and take. It can bring high energy, as Rob's saying, as long as, and I think that's really crucial, Rob, there's that sense of progress and moving forwards. Yeah, the high energy then gets well used. Jill, are you feeling the uncomfortable feelings rise, hanging on in there until a shift happens? Yeah. So you might be, as the facilitator, as the coach, encouraging people to trust the process. I often set a ground rule in sessions I run around welcoming uncomfortable moments, so we don't fight shy of the discomfort. So there's a cooperative atmosphere, there's acceptance that conflict is necessary to achieve the best solution, coming out of that rounded out thinking from everybody. Thank you there, Victoria. Thank you, everybody. What great observations. Building on others' ideas, even if different. Yes, thank you, Shelley. There's a real difference when comments are additive in a meeting rather than subtractive, if I frame it like that. So this is a huge territory to be covering. But we did just want to make that differentiation at the start, that there is this version of disagreement and conflict that can actually be so rich and so enhancing of how a team functions. And so, what we want to share with you very shortly are 3 tools for how you can fork down that path rather than down a path where the tension, the friction in the room really stymies the dialogue and keeps you stuck in polarization or fixed positions. So, at this point, Klaus, I'm going to hand back to you to take us through, I think, the first of the 2 or the first couple of the 3 tools, please. So, back over to you, Klaus.
So, as Sarah was saying, today we're going to present 3 practical tools. In these webinars, we like to give you something that you can basically implement 5 minutes after the meeting. We like to be very practical in that sense. So we'll present 3 tools that you can use to optimize dialogue in relationship to when you are talking to somebody who has an opinion that is different from yours and maybe even slightly incomprehensible. And one of the sort of theoretical frameworks that we work a lot with when we're out in organizations and teaching this material is William Isaacs and David Cantor. We work a lot with those. And one of the things that William Isaacs says is that in order to be effective in opposing others, you need to practice respecting. And unfortunately, he uses a word that we all think we know what means, but he means something very specific when he says that. So he means, basically what he means by respecting is to work from 2 assumptions. The one assumption is there is something valuable in what the other person is saying, even if you can't see it. And the second assumption is no matter how much you try, you can never fully understand the other person's position. And one of the things that these 2 assumptions do is they make you curious. If you think you understand fully another person's position, you're no longer curious because you already got it. If you think there's nothing valuable in what the other person is saying, you're not curious. Why would you be? There's nothing there. But if you think there is something valuable and you know you have to keep digging and asking questions in order to get it, you get curious. So the first two tools we are introducing are tools for how to spark your own curiosity. And so the first one is if you operate from the assumption there is something positive or something to be learned from what the other person is saying, even if you can't see it, well, you'll have to put in an effort to make visible what that is. And many times, if you work with when you're out working with managers, when in my PhD, I had the pleasure of talking to 60 managers and asking them, why do you think other people in the organization think differently from you? And the most common explanations I got were one, they are self-interested. Right? They want what's good for them, not what's good for the organization, and that's why they have that opinion. How many can relate to having experienced somebody and thinking, yeah, this comes out of self-interest? Not. I see a couple of nodding. Yeah. The other thing that I see very often is it's because they're stupid, right? They're just daft. They just don't understand things. How many sometimes feel, in all honesty, that that's probably where the opposing opinion comes from? It's just they're just a bit dumb. You don't want to say that it's about their colleagues. If I promise not to tell them, all right. And the last one I think that was very common was a little bit related. It was to something like saying something along the lines, I understand where they're coming from. I understand that when they see what they see, I understand why they come to that conclusion. But I can see more. I have a broader picture, And that's why I come to a different conclusion. And if they could see what I saw, surely they would come to the same conclusion. So there is this assumption I see everything they see plus something more. And that's a little bit against the second assumption. You assume you understand the other person's position fully. How many people feel that's the case? Yeah. And it's funny, sometimes in the hierarchy, it works differently. The top manager said, well, we have the strategic overview. So that's why we see what we see. And the people on the floor don't see that because they don't, operate at that level. But the people at the lowest level of the organization, they say, well, we engage with customers every single day, and top management does not. That's why we understand what's actually going on. So there's something interesting in knowing people see things from different perspectives because they're situated in different places in the organization, and nobody sees everything. So if you get curious about that, then you have to ask yourself the question, what is it that the other person see that is valuable? What is their positive intention? Can I formulate my opponent's point of view stronger than they can? I think those are some of the guiding questions that I find really useful for getting into the shoes of the other person. What is it that the other person is trying? Maybe let's put it this way. What is the other person trying to say or do, even if they're not formulating it well? And can I give it an even stronger expression? So I'm going to tell a quick story, a short little story to illustrate this. Once I was working with an organization, and their whole raison d'etre was that they went into elementary schools, and then they had talks with teachers, students, and parents about alcohol consumption. Now, the research shows very clearly that if you can postpone when children start drinking alcohol, it's going to solve a whole host of societal problems. So, of course, they had this agenda in mind. How can we make this? How can we help teachers and students and parents come to some sort of common agreement about what's allowed and what's not allowed that will help enforce those rules? If everybody's on the same page, it's easier to enforce the rules. And they said every single time we're out in schools, we always meet a particular character. We always meet that one person who says, I started drinking alcohol when I was 6. It's never done me any harm. And by the way, I don't believe in the science. And also, if you look at Benny or whoever, somebody in the class, that person has the most strict parents enforcing the most strict rules, and that's the person that drinks the most. So it doesn't work enforcing the rules. And the people in this organization says, how do you even begin having a dialogue with a person like that? And you can relate it in organizations. If you present the numbers and somebody just say, well, I don't believe the numbers, it might seem like a bit of an uphill battle. How many can relate to this kind of situations? Yeah, I see some nodding even before I ask, right? So we did the exercise. Now, of course, we didn't have somebody representing the view in the room, but we did the exercise. What is it that's true and important that they are trying to say, even if they're not formulating it very well? And I think for me, the sentence that stood out was the sentence about look at Benny or Jack or whoever it was. And if you think a little deeper about that, you can see that they're actually pointing to something really important. And that is, if you just enforce very strict rules on your children, you might cause a rupture in the relationship. And if you cause a rupture in the relationship, they might not listen to you anymore. And as a parent, you really don't want your teenager to come to a place where they completely, they're not going to listen to you, but completely not listen to you, right? That's a problem. And you have the same sort of dynamics in organizations. Once I worked with a multinational corporation where there was a central unit of data analysts, and they were analyzing data from different offshore teams to see which projects would give a return on investment and which would not. And they said it was very difficult because, on the one hand, they need a good working relationship with the offshore teams, and on the other hand, they had to shoot down a ton of their projects, right? They were very excited about their portfolio of projects, and then they had to say, yeah, out of 10 of those projects, you just have to shut them down because they're never going to give a return on investment. And it was complicated because sometimes the offshore team would go out and just do the projects anyway because they don't, all those people in the central unit, they don't know what they're talking about. So that concern for preservation of the relationship, it's not exactly what they were saying. They say, I don't believe the science and yaddy-daddy-daddy. But if you listen to them close enough, you can say, well, actually, you're onto something. You are concerned with preserving a good working relationship, in this case with your children, and that's important. And that pivoted the whole dialogue. Instead of saying the question that we're trying to answer is what should be the rules, now the question expanded. What are the rules and how should they be enforced in a way that keeps a good relationship? That's a much better question. So actually, that person who seemed a little bit unhinged and crazy, actually, when you listen to them and try to figure out what are they trying to communicate, it was a very, very valuable contribution to the conversation. Does that make sense? So this is the first tool. Really get serious about asking yourself the question, what is the valuable thing they're trying to communicate? And can I communicate their point of view even better than they are communicating it? It goes against your intuition because you think if you're in a conflict, you have to argue your own point of view very well, not the other person's, right? If you argue the other person's, they're gonna win, and that's a problem. But actually, if you argue the other person's position really well, it opens their ears, it opens up the dialogue, and what you thought was just crazy talk might end up being a really valuable contribution to the conversation. So that's the first tool. Argue the other person's point of view. The second tool is kind of the flip side of that. So that is to say, being transparent about what are the flaws in your own point of view. No point of view, no plan is ever perfect. I work at Copenhagen Business School. I do a lot of work in academia. And there it's sort of, whenever you do a piece of research, part of when you write it up, you always criticize your own work. And if you don't, you can bet that the anonymous reviewers are going to do it for you. Right, so I also review a lot. I never get a paper where I say, oh, this is fantastic, there is nothing to comment here, right? There's always something to comment. It hurts an academic person's pride to not be able to point to some sort of flaw. And being able to see the flaws in your own point of view is incredibly powerful. Because if you present a plan and then you are transparent and you say, I know already that this and this and this and this, these are downsides in my plans, it often has the effect that the other person relaxes. Because they say, okay, they can see the problems with the plan. And that means I can go closer to them and work more with them. If you think that somebody is going off on a tangent, they're oblivious to the risks, you are gonna dig in your heels and not want to work with them and just point out all the flaws, right? And that creates that polarization in the dialogue. If they themselves are transparent and say, well, I know that these are the risks and I think we can manage it in this way, I'm curious to hear your input on it. Can you feel how it really relieves tension? And you say, okay, I can breathe now. It doesn't trigger a fear response. Once I was working with a manager in a public sector organization, and she had a conflict with a colleague. Her point of view was, we are the experts. We have been doing this job across multiple administrations. We know what the risks are. New administration come in, they want to assert their, show that they can do a lot of things. They want to change everything, and they also want to change the things that work. And some of their ideas are dumb. As experts, it's our responsibility to give pushback and say, this is a stupid idea. We shouldn't do that. And here's why. Her colleague, on the other hand, said, no, the politicians ask us to implement this, and we're hired to implement it. We just implement it. And they had that conflict, and it really hampered their collaboration. And her view was, this other person lacks the courage to stand up to the politicians. And that's why. She's lazy, she's not courageous enough. And it's interesting because the moment you have an idea about somebody else's motivation, you also have implicitly said, what's the path forward? If the other person is lazy and lack courage, well, you have to persuade them that it's their duty and that they should, find the courage to do what they're supposed to do. Now, we had a little talk, and then I was saying, like, well, can you see the flaws in your own logic? What's the flaws in saying that you should push back on bad policies? And after, it didn't take long to find the flaw, right? The flaw is, well, civil servants are not publicly elected. So it's actually a little bit problematic for the democratic process to take on that stance. If the broader population elects certain politicians, it's because the broader population wants that politician to generate policies. So if you oppose that, that's a problem. And seeing that you can make a good argument for the opposite side. It's not to say that one side or the other side is right, but now we're in a place where we say, well, it's a bit of a balance. We should give pushback on bad ideas, and at the same time, we should respect the democratic process. So now we can have a productive dialogue about how we manage that balancing act. And it really helped the collaboration that when she started becoming, I was only working with one side, right? When she started becoming transparent and say, I can see this, I can see that there is something slightly undemocratic in what I say, but I still think Sarah often asks the questions, says that relate to this. She says, what's the risk if we do it? And what's the risk if we don't do it? And that makes transparent that there are flaws in all sides. And when we're transparent about what those flaws are, now we can have a productive dialogue where nobody's worried that the opposite side can't see certain risks. So those are two tools that are really important, and they're flip sides of each other. One is put in an effort and say, what is the other side trying to say? Can I give it an even stronger formulation? And what's the value in it? And then the opposite side is, what are the risks or downsides or flaws or, untested assumptions that I base my side on? And what happens if I'm transparent about that? And I think the overall, if we zoom out for a bit, you can say, well, if you look at the opposite side and you say, is it because they are trying to make this particular point, yes or no? Or is it because they're just stupid? Or is it because they're just selfish? I think a thing that's worth remembering is multiple things can be true at the same time. Maybe they're saying something that is a valuable contribution to the conversation, and they're a bit selfish at the same time. Now, that means you have multiple correct interpretations of the other person's behavior. The Encouragement would be pick the interpretation that provides a path forward. If it's true that the other person is just selfish, what are you gonna do? It doesn't really provide a path forward. If they're onto something, that might provide a path forward. And when you choose to mirror back to somebody else their positive intentions, it tends to amplify those intentions in the other person. So you actually have a bit of a say which of the, if there's like 3 different things driving the other person, which one do you want to highlight? It's better to highlight the one that can provide a path forward in a productive dialogue. And one explanation that is often very good is, instead of saying it's personal attributes, you can say it's because we have different models of the world. And with that, I'll hand back to Sarah, who then is going to say something about the third tool, which is a very potent tool as well.
Very happy to do that. Just before I go there, Klaus, there is a question in the chat from Shelley. If you want to pick up on and respond to that, and then I can come in with that third tool. Do you want to go there now?
Yes, of course. Like, as a patronizing person, I think if you're if you just unmute and say, like, do which one of them formulate the other person's point of view
First one.
stronger? Is that the one?
Yeah. Fine. Yeah.
I think it's the yes and attitude. If somebody says, I think we should do this, and you say, that's a really good idea, and maybe you build on the idea and say it would be even stronger if we could do it like that, I think nobody's going to say, oh, now you're being patronizing. I think they're just saying, well, you're being collaborative, you're being helpful. And I think it's the same attitude. If somebody says, let's go back to the alcohol example, right? I don't believe in science, da, da, da. And if you say, well, I think it's interesting what you're saying about this person and the strict parents, because when you say that, I can see that, of course, you don't want to rupture the relationship. And they might go like, yeah, that's exactly it, right? Because now you're feeding them material for strengthening their position. And I don't think anybody is going to go like, oh, that's really patronizing. But I understand your question, because you could go in and say, oh, so, I mean, you're not saying it very well. But if you allow me to say what I think you're really trying to say, right? Yeah, that would be patronizing. But if you more come at it from like an exploratory position and say, well, I can actually see there's something to what you're saying. Like, if I put myself in your shoes, I would see this as something important, and you just formulate it in a strong way. I think most people would just see it as collaborative and helpful. Does that? Cool. Good question.
Thank you. Thanks, Shelley. Thank you, Klaus. And yeah, please keep using the chat with any further questions, comments. I'm going to cover the third tool, and then we want to open it up for some dialogue amongst us as well. So comments, questions, really welcome here. So yeah, this third tool I used very recently in a piece of work where there was really quite a high degree of conflict in the room. So I might just share that experience and then back up into the tool more generally. The notion here is how to have what gets called a cross model conversation. That's how David Cantor, who Klaus has already referred to, he conceptualized it in that way, a cross model conversation. And really, what you're doing is reframing in a meeting, in an encounter, so that instead of it turning into a turf war or a personality clash, instead of the heat getting cranked up even further because it then becomes really personal, you bring in this notion of there are different models in the room and let's talk that through. And so the way that I use this in a recent piece of work, just to set a little bit of context, and I'm going to keep it completely anonymous as well, is there was a board of a not-for-profit foundation. And the foundation had basically been put on hold for 2 years because of an unresolved conflict amongst the 5 board members. So I went in, and part of my role was to help them navigate that conflict. And yeah, for the first part of my time with them, we aired some grievances, acknowledged some hurt. So the cross model conversation wasn't the very first thing I did with them, it came later in our time together. And going into that session, I'd understood that there were 2 different models, let's say, of how to give money from the foundation. But it turned out that actually, when I said to them, testing my assumption there were just 2 models of giving, it turned out there were actually 4 different models potentially, because model one had a version A and a version B, and model two had a version A and a version B. Anyway, what we did was we just started that part of the dialogue by clearly defining, in effect, the 4 models. And we called them that model 1A and 1B, oops, and then model 2A and 2B. I'm hoping you can still hear me. Can you give me a nod? Thank you very much. So, having brought in, and that helped turn down the heat, a degree of objectivity and neutrality, we laid those 4 models out on 4 separate pieces of paper. And we actually added in another piece of paper at this point, which said other possibilities. And what I then did was we cleared the meeting room, so we had some space to work on the floor, and we laid down those 5 pieces of paper. And I asked people to go and vote with their feet and stand on the piece of paper or by the piece of paper of the model that had most of their support. And by making it physical and spatializing it as well, I think it's really helpful as a general rule in dialogue work to get out of our seats and up on our feet, because actually that alone brings in some dynamism, some movement, some physical movement into the room, which can help move some stuck energy, just that alone. So, a very intentional move on my behalf. Anyway, at that point, what became clear was that we basically had 2 different camps, let's say, in the room by how people clustered around the pieces of paper. It made it really clear the positions that people were taking, and we could talk that through. So we had quite a high energy dialogue up on our feet amongst the 5 of them. And if I just cut to the end of the story, I'd love to be able to say to you, well, that sort of sorted it all out. That's not actually quite what happened, but what did happen that was super helpful was by going through that process of the cross model conversation, it became really clear that in order for them to, as a 5, to land on one model going forward, they actually needed to go out and gather more information. And that was the action that all 5 of them agreed to, got behind, um, and there was absolutely a sense at the end of those days together that we had got forward motion, that what had been very stuck for a couple of years had got unstuck. And I shall be meeting them again online in a couple of months to continue the cross-model conversation with more information folded in. So that's a recent experience of using a cross-model conversation. I'll just make a couple of more general points, and then, as I say, we want to open it up for questions and comments from you. So when we reframe a conflict as a cross-model conversation, it really helps to depersonalize things just in that reframing. It also intellectually then encourages people to have a sense of what their own model is. And actually, that can bring in some clarity of thinking. And that very much builds on the first couple of tools that Klaus was talking about. It's up to you if you're facilitating the dialogue or leading the dialogue or convening it in some way, whether you might even encourage participants to begin their sentences with things like, well, in my model or in my way of thinking, da da da, just so that the dialogue is held in that way. And I think it's super helpful because it encourages us to see the other people in the room not as opponents, but as fellow participants in the dialogue. David Cantor talks about if we can see other people bringing in helpful constraint to our own model, our own way of thinking, and we have the humility, and again, Klaus has talked about this, to accept that we've got blind spots, we've got flaws in our thinking sometimes, and other people can shine the light on it, then we're much more likely to have a constructive conversation. And I'll just close this bit with a quote of mine, a quote that's a favourite of mine, that is from the writer Neil Donald Walsh. So he says, nobody does anything wrong given their model of the world. And the reason that that's close to my own heart, and I think very relevant to dialogue work, is if we can walk into the room with that as our attitude, that we're not making other people wrong, we're not othering other people, it's just they've got a different model of how the world works, how the business works, how society works, then that helps to create a more expansive atmosphere inside of us. There's more room for us to be generous in our thinking and interactions. And then that more expansive inner atmosphere also helps generate a more expansive and spacious atmosphere in the meeting room. And it's in that more spacious atmosphere that really good dialogue can happen. So that's our third tool, the cross model conversation. And so that's all the input we wanted to cover today. We wanted to leave this session with some space for questions and comments. So you'd be welcome to use the chat. Thank you, Laurie. Or please, you could raise a hand, whether that's physically or digitally. Love to hear your voice with any comments or questions. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. And I know I've already briefly covered about ground rules, and I'd be interested to hear from any of you about any ground rules or group agreements that you've used or do use that can help create an environment, or often in dialogue work, a container. That's the term we often use, that can hold, as you've been speaking about, those differences of opinion, those tensions as well. I've already mentioned about setting that ground rule about welcome on comfortable moments. And that has served some meetings so well when tension has arisen, because I've kind of gone back to that and said, well, look, that's what we've contracted for. So let's all take a deeper breath here and slow down. It gives you permission to slow down rather than gloss over the uncomfortable moments. Along similar lines, I've used ground rules like nobody gets to be wrong here. We might not reach agreement, and often we say in dialogue work, it's less about reaching agreement. It's more about building a shared understanding. And to get that shared understanding, it really helps to contract for that agreement. Nobody gets to be wrong. And I can see comments coming into the chat. So let me have a look at those. And Klaus, I'm also going to invite you in here as well, just what you might have to say in response.
I think we're getting a lot of good ground rules, right? The curiosity ground rule is a good one. Yeah, I think that's very important. And the ground rule you mentioned about welcoming uncomfortable moments also relate to being curious about the uncomfortable moments rather than sort of managing them or avoiding them. I sometimes suggest as a ground rule speaking from the owning stuff. Yes, definitely, right. That's also when what you're talking about in the cross model conversation. In my view, it looks like this rather than saying that's how it is.
Yes. As Nikki's point as well, yeah, just that assuming positive intent. Thank you, Nikki. That too just can create a different kind of atmosphere. There's then more, I think, generosity towards other people when you assume others are coming from a good intent. Yeah, I mean, it might be they come from quite tangibly different places. So in that example of working with the not-for-profit, it was very tangible, the differences in model. And I won't go into the detail of that just to protect anonymity. Um, but in other situations where we've had a cross-model conversation, it's been less tangible. So, for example, I worked with a board where there were the exec directors and the non-execs. And I tell the story in my book Now We're Talking, if you want the fuller version of this. But what arose was, in effect, a difference in models around how you build trust in the board. And that was to do with how information was shared, how much information was shared, the timing at which information was shared. And none of that was actually really clear until we were really in the dialogue itself. I didn't have a sense going into that meeting that that was an issue, and we had to kind of articulate and unpack the models in the meeting itself because it was more intangible in that way. So I don't know if that answers your question, Jill, but it's worked in different ways in my experience.
Maybe just to add something, because I think one way of thinking about it is that these models come from, for example, educational background. So if your education is finance, you have the whole arsenal of concepts that you learn through this education to think with. If you are in research and development, for example, you're an engineer or something, you have a different set of concepts to think with. So education is important. Department, what department you're in, there are different um, organizational logics that govern different departments, which the overall culture of the industry, the overall culture of where you were born and raised. So there, you have been provided a lot of concepts and models, and those are the ones that you use to deal with the world with, and they can be quite different.
Mm. There is that quote as well, isn't there? All models are wrong, some are useful.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good one. And we need to also be aware everyone sees something from our own perspective, but all parties should have a shared perspective of for each other and their models of the world. Yeah, exactly, right. It is this. Sometimes we talk about dialogue as a conversation with a center, not side, and it's very useful because it's like you have what you're talking about in the center, and because you're sitting around it, you're literally seeing it from a different angle and seeing different things because you have a different vantage point.
I'll just share one quick thought, and that is, it's reminding me of Adam Kahane's work on solving tough problems. And what I love about that book in particular, so his work is less corporate, more geopolitical. He's worked on conflict situations, dialogues throughout the world, South America, the Middle East. And in that book, he writes the stories um, along a spectrum about the degree to which they were able to move through the conflict through a process of dialogue. And some of it wasn't successful and some of it was. And the key thing that Kahane points to is open mindedness. And if you're going into a high degree of conflict where actually minds are very closed, even the best dialogue facilitator can struggle to build a shared understanding. So, and I respect him for acknowledging that, naming that. And as I say, there are many other stories in that book and in my own experience where, you can move through entrenched positions when there is a degree of open-mindedness on the behalf of the participants. So that's just a thought in response to that.
So maybe just to yeah, maybe just to round off. So just to say, Sarah and I are very passionate about this. We think it's amazing work, and we think it's very important work, and we also think it's very important in today's climate, you can say. And so sometimes we give open workshops where people from different organizations come. We don't have anything in the calendar at the moment, but usually the way it works is if any of you are interested in that, drop us a line. When enough people have dropped us a line, we'll find some days and we'll do it. The other thing we do is we go into organizations and do these workshops. It's 2-day workshops. Usually we will do little interviews with all the participants in advance because, as you can see from today's workshop, we're very passionate about making these things uh, concrete and practicable. So we try to figure out what are the actual things that we want to talk about, and then we teach about dialogue in relation to that. So you don't just get the theory, you actually get to apply it to something that's important. This is why we really like the in-house work. Yeah, and so just rounding off if any of you think, oh, it would be fantastic to get Claus and Sarah to come and do a 2-day workshop at the where I work, please put us in touch with whoever we should talk to, whoever's in charge of training in your organization. And we'd be happy to just have an informal chat with people, and then maybe we can see each other in person. So yeah, so and then of course regarding the webinars, we have 4 more lined up, and please spread the word. So the more the merrier. It's very nice. We greatly appreciate if you find this interesting. Tell all your friends about it, and then we will have more people here. So that's it. Do you have anything, Sarah, for rounding off? Or?
I'm just going to say a big thank you for coming today, especially if you're in the UK and it is a sunny bank holiday Monday and you've been here for an hour. But thank you, everybody, and hope to see you again. All the very best. Thank you.
Yes. Take care.